Hello, everybody, and welcome to ICMDA webinars. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from over 100 affiliated national movements worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, our number 235, we're privileged to have Dr. Matthew Eppinette speaking on bioethics yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So we're looking back and looking forward as well. So it's a great privilege to welcome Dr. Matthew Eppinette. Bioethics has brought a slate of topics over the last few years. And today we face a set of complex and pressing issues, and the dilemmas of tomorrow are at most just over the horizon. This talk's going to include a few comments about the bioethics of yesterday before turning to the issues of today and tomorrow, which, as you might expect, are closely intertwined. And then finally, it will close with brief remarks on how we as Christians might respond. Dr. Matthew Eppinette, MBA, PhD, is Executive Director of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, and also an affiliate professor of bioethics at Trinity International University in Chicago, US. He has 2 decades of experience in the field of bioethics. He holds a PhD in theology with concentrations in Christian ethics and theology and culture from the Center for Advanced Theological Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, where he also earned an MA in theology. And during his time at the Center for Bioethics and Culture, there he co-wrote and co-produced 6 documentary films addressing bioethics issues. 3 of these films were official film festival selections, and 1 was awarded Best Documentary. Matthew and his wife, Ginger, currently reside in suburban Chicago. Matthew, such a pleasure to have you here. We really look forward to hearing what you have to say and engaging with you in Q&A afterwards. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The issues of bioethics all address the question of how we treat human beings in the specific context of the frailties of human life in the aftermath of the fall. Perhaps there is no more important thread that runs through bioethics yesterday, today, and tomorrow than this. The issues of bioethics all address the question of how we treat human beings in the specific context of the frailties of human life in the aftermath of the fall. As Dr. Saunders said, in this talk, I'll make a few comments about bioethics yesterday, but I'll spend most of my time talking about bioethics today and bioethics tomorrow, which are closely intertwined. Before I turn to that, though, let me just say thank you for having me here. Greetings from Chicago, where it is a balmy minus 14 C. That's 6 Fahrenheit for those of you who keep score in that method. The center that I lead began hosting conferences to address the Christian stake in bioethics more than 30 years ago. The first few conferences, in particular, sought to set forth what the discipline of bioethics was or was becoming, and ways in which Christians might affect both emerging and ongoing questions of how we treat human beings in the specific context of the frailties of human life in the aftermath of the fall. The challenges raised in our early conferences included the lack of explicitly Christian engagement in the arena of bioethics, end-of-life issues, particularly the potential for the legalization of assisted suicide in the United States, coming developments in the area of genetics, which was top of mind given the launch of the Human Genome Project in 1990. Reproductive technologies were also assessed in the first few years, as were ideas and strategies toward informing the public, shaping public opinion, and addressing bioethical issues via public policy. And of course, as you might imagine, these conference topics have been visited many times since 1994. To mark the 30th anniversary of the founding of the center, we ran a survey asking, What is the most significant development in bioethics in the past 30 years? We offered 4 options: the cloning of Dolly the sheep, the legalization and spread of assisted suicide, the Human Genome Project, CRISPR gene editing, and we left a space for voters to fill in another item. The results of the survey show Dolly the sheep at 7%, the legalization of assisted suicide at 24%, the Human Genome Project at 21%, and the development of CRISPR at 30%. 18% voted for other, and among the items that they listed, reproductive technologies, brain-computer interfaces, increased emphasis on autonomy, artificial intelligence, the rise and prominence of transgender debates, the coalescing of bioethics as a discipline, and the 2022 United States Supreme Court decision in Dobbs, which overturned the abortion precedent in Roe versus Wade. Interesting results. Surprising? Not surprising? I'll leave it to you to decide. Now, much more could be said about yesterday, but let us move on. Recent media requests here at the Center provide a window, a starting point, if you will, to begin thinking about where bioethics stands today, and perhaps even a glimmer of where we're going tomorrow. Those requests have included proposed changes to the 14-day rule, artificial wombs, 3-parent embryos, assisted suicide and euthanasia in the US, and both assisted suicide and euthanasia in other countries, and the ethics of brain-computer interfaces. Important issues all, for sure, and a snapshot of the state of media and public interest. But what about those issues that escape the media's attention? According to a 2018 study by the Center to Advance Palliative Care, the prevalence of hospitals with 50 or more beds in the United States with a palliative care team increased 178%. That is, they went from 658 to 1,831 hospitals between 2000 and 2016. This is very good news. Of course, as you will likely know, legalized assisted suicide has grown even as the availability of palliative care has grown. It's now legal in 10 U.S. states and the District of Columbia. Legalization of assisted suicide was considered last year in 24 of the 50 U.S. states. Most of this legislation would have legalized assisted suicide for the first time, although some of this legislation was aimed to expand assisted suicide in states where it was already legal. Legislation to newly legalize assisted suicide passed only in the state of Delaware, and there only by a single vote. And the governor vetoed it. In Colorado, where assisted suicide was already legal, legislation passed that reduced waiting times and that added the ability for nurse practitioners to prescribe the lethal drugs. If you've followed the situation in Canada, then you've seen the worst of the worst when it comes to what proponents there call medical aid in dying, or MAID. Alexander Rankin's writing on this in the New Atlantis is the definitive coverage of the situation there in Canada. MAID there includes options for both assisted suicide and active direct euthanasia. But Rankin reports that in Canada, quote, virtually all such deaths, over 99%, are euthanasia, close quote. Now, of course, there are significant differences between Canada and the United States. Perhaps foremost in the context of this topic is the nationalized health system there and our insurance system here. Rankin reports that it is a system that encourages the vulnerable to seek medical death. A system that encourages the vulnerable to seek medical death. The result In 2023, the latest year for which we have numbers, 15,343 people were reported to have died under Canada's MAID system. 15,343. Euthanasia is now the cause of 1 in 20 deaths in Canada. If it were listed as the cause of death, MAID would have been the 4th leading cause of death in Canada in 2023. Cancer was first at 84,000. Heart disease, 57, almost 58,000. Accidents, 20,000. MAID, 15,000. And then cerebrovascular diseases at 13,000. It seems clear that in Canada, people are being pushed toward MAID for economic reasons, lack of affordable housing, credit card debt, as well as veterans who need modifications such as chairlifts or treatment for PTSD. Now, my core opposition to assisted suicide flows from our creation in the image of God. We simply are not to take human life, even our own. Beyond that, the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia is simply not wise public policy. It is out of step with the historic practice of medicine. The American Medical Association's Code of Medical Ethics states, quote, "Physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer. It would be difficult or impossible to control, and it would pose serious societal risks," close quote. Second, it's well documented that legalizing assisted suicide increases overall suicide rates. Suicide contagion is real. Third, assisted suicide laws put those with disability at risk. In the United States, all national disability rights organizations who hold a position on assisted suicide oppose it. And then fourth, every dollar spent trying to enact assisted suicide laws is a dollar in the US or euro or whatever your currency is that could have gone toward improving patient care at the end of life. The way to provide aid to the dying is to invest additional resources into hospice and palliative care. This is in keeping with the historic practice of medicine. It protects those at risk for suicide and those living with disability. Our number one vote getter for the most significant development over the past 30 years was CRISPR. In his introduction to the book, The Codebreaker, Walter Isaacson writes, "Figuring out if and when to edit our genes will be one of the most consequential questions of the 21st century." Already we're seeing wonderful results from work with CRISPR. Victoria Gray, 37 years old, from the state of Mississippi here in the United States, was the first person with sickle cell disease to receive a CRISPR-based treatment for it. And today, all of her symptoms are gone. She states, "It's a huge difference, night and day. I feel like I got a second chance at life." I mentioned earlier the birth of gene-edited babies in China in 2018. This was the work of Hui Jianqiu, and my apologies to our Chinese translator, who served 3 years in prison for it. In March of 2023, the third International Summit on Human Genome Editing took place. At the conclusion of the meeting, the summit's organizing committee put out its closing statement. Heritable genome editing, that is, editing embryos that are then implanted to establish a pregnancy, which can pass on edited DNA, quote, "remains unacceptable at this time," close quote, at this time. Public discussions and policy debates continue and are important for resolving whether this technology should be used, the statement concludes. But how long will this moratorium hold? For what reasons will it be overturned? And in the meantime, how many embryos will be modified but not transferred into a womb? Artificial intelligence has come to increased prominence over the past couple of years thanks to the introduction of large language models, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Bard, Microsoft's Copilot, and text-to-image and text-to-video models like DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, Adobe's Firefly, and others. As I'm sure you know, AI exists along something of a continuum, from algorithms of various complexities to the yet still pursued, hoped for by some and feared by others, artificial general intelligence. One area where AI is playing an increasing role already is in the realm of drug discovery. Machine programming can mix and match various chemical elements in an attempt to discover new medicines. On the other hand, researchers at a North Carolina pharmaceutical company ran an experiment with one such AI, making a small coding change that caused it to generate 40,000 deadly molecules. Indeed, many worry about the existential threat from AI. However, other concerns are already evident. The generation and amplification of misinformation, bias in training inputs and data outputs, and then issues of privacy that are related to the amounts of data that are needed for training. A Wall Street Journal headline proclaimed, "When AI overrules the nurses caring for you." From the article, in a survey of 1,042 registered nurses published by National Nurses United, 24% of respondents said they had been prompted by a clinical AI algorithm to make choices they believed were not in the best interest of patients based on their clinical judgment and scope of practice. The issues included areas such as patient care and staffing. Now, of those respondents who had been prompted, 17% said they were permitted to override the decision. 31% were not allowed to override the decision, and 34% said they needed a doctor or supervisor's permission. You may also be aware there is now a New England Journal of Medicine journal that is focused solely on artificial intelligence, covering developments of AI in the medical field. Among other current issues in bioethics, a member of CBHD's Academy of Fellows has focused her work on the environmental impact of healthcare, from the energy required to run hospitals to the carbon footprint of the pharmaceutical industry and more. 3-parent embryos are opening a door to all kinds of genetic manipulations and sit alongside work of creating life in the lab and holding it there for longer. Scientists have recently kept primate embryos in a lab for 25 days post-fertilization, achieving key developmental landmarks never before observed in culture, including the start of organ development. There's now a strong push to extend the 14-day rule on how long human embryos may be kept alive in the lab. And with results like this in primates, maybe it's only a matter of time. Synthetic human embryos have been created in a project involving Cambridge and Caltech. And time does not allow mention, certainly, of all the issues we face today. But I've tried to mention a few that seem significant to me, and perhaps some that are less closely followed than they might be. So now let us look ahead. In some ways, it's difficult to disentangle fully the bioethics issues of today and tomorrow. Perhaps some of the pressing issues we deal with now will be solved or will fade away, but it seems to me more likely that we'll continue dealing, at least in some measure, with many of them while adding new issues. Wired magazine, for example, has presented a list of developments we might expect to see in hospitals soon. And they include fully autonomous surgical robots. And I've recently seen news reports on teams that are working to develop these. Smart toilets that monitor health and detect disease. 3D printed organs. Ambient documentation. That's artificial intelligence listening in during exams and then summarizing and charting. And I do know that some of this is now going on, some of it even here in Chicago. And knives that, quote unquote, smell tumors. A while back, I received an email from Amazon letting me know that one of their Prime Day deals was 25% off my first year of membership in their One Medical program. It offers 24/7 virtual visits, in-person appointments in selected areas, and of course, close integration with Amazon Pharmacy. What does the future of healthcare look like with a company like Amazon getting involved? That would give Amazon a ton of information about me, not that they don't already know a lot about me. It's interesting, too, that Amazon uses the language of provider, as in compassionate providers who take time to listen and send and receive secure messages with a provider. This stands in sharp contrast to the physician as a professional, and this is another likely change as we move forward. The continued transition from the physician as a covenantal professional to the physician as a transactional provider, much like a contractor who comes in to work on your house. This is a significant change to the place and the role of the physician, and it strains the physician's conscience. Notions around the concept of personhood are likely to change or expand. We're already seeing the emergence of the somewhat novel concept of the non-human person. Artificial intelligences and perhaps some other animal species might fit this category. Robots and androids raise interesting questions regarding things like autonomy and responsibility. One law professor says, quote, "In America, almost all of our laws at the local, state, and federal levels share an assumption. All decisions are made by a human being." Close quote. What does free will look like for a robot or android? Who is responsible for the things that robots do? Can or should robots be punished for wrongdoing or law breaking? Alternatively, is it possible to commit the crime of murder against a robot or an AI? Already the concept of personhood and the idea of rights are beginning to expand beyond human beings. For example, there was a case in New York State seeking to establish the personhood of an elephant in order to release it from a zoo. An Argentinian court ruled in 2014 that an orangutan is a, quote, non-human person, close quote. Might these concepts be extended to robots and artificial intelligences? How might human-machine hybrid cyborgs be viewed? Similarly, what do we do with concepts like human dignity? Might there be such a thing as e-person or AI person dignity? New technologies have far-reaching and long-lasting effects. Consider this from an article on Anabaptist technology. As Neil Postman argues, it is not possible to contain the effects of technology to a limited sphere of human activity. One significant change generates total change. He gives a string of examples to illustrate the point. If you remove the caterpillars from a given habitat, you're not left with the same environment minus caterpillars. You have a new environment, and you've reconstituted the conditions of survival. The same is true if you add caterpillars to an environment that has none. Likewise, in 1500, 50 years after the printing press was invented, We didn't have old Europe plus the printing press. We had a different Europe. The same was true after the invention of the automobile, radio, television, and every other major technology. This widespread ecological change is both inevitable and it is uncertain. Consider what it might mean to substitute other issues into this framework. 50 years after euthanasia and assisted suicide were legalized, we didn't have the same world plus assisted suicide and euthanasia. We had a different world. Or perhaps something tangentially related, but closer to us, in our pockets and purses, 18 years after the smartphone was introduced. 9 years after medical aid in dying was legalized in Canada. Or maybe I overstate the case. Doubtless there will also be something we're not expecting, something only a few anticipate that will come quickly or in unexpected ways. Of course, these concerns are, at least for now, very much concerns of the developed world. I'm well aware that there are parts of this world where the concerns are much different. Access to even the most basic of healthcare, access even to clean water. And of course, there are other areas of the world that are beset by war, by famine, and by disaster. To sum up these issues of tomorrow, in my estimation, the most significant issues will be the continued spread of assisted suicide and an increasing push toward euthanasia, gene editing, issues that arise out of artificial intelligence, issues of conscience that arise in the above, and something I'm not fully aware of because it's not fully on many people's radar. Now, in some ways, these are symptoms. There are deeper issues at work. Nigel Cameron writes that the practice of medicine has historically represented the interlocking of Christian and Hippocratic values. Alongside the rise of bioethics, Cameron in 1994 saw the collapse of Judeo-Christian anthropology. He writes, "We should anticipate a radical divergence of perspectives between those who would maintain the Judeo-Christian anthropology and those whose very starting point is its repudiation. Indeed, insofar as the humane medical tradition was the epitome of that Judeo-Christian anthropology, a case could be made for seeing bioethics as the cockpit of the struggle with post-Christian concepts of our nature, the test bed for new understandings of what it means to be human in the twilight of the Christian era." And what corrective does Cameron offer? He says our engagement in these many questions of bioethics must find its grounding in the distinctives of a Judeo-Christian anthropology. He insists we must recover a clear biblical and historical conviction of the nature of Christian medicine and its stake in the fate of the public Hippocratic tradition. The work of Christians who are concerned about the issues of bioethics should first be marked by energetic exploration of both the biblical theological distinctives which ground our medical anthropology and the public tradition of Christian Hippocratism, which has carried those concerns down the lifetime of our civilization. So how do we respond? Let us look, if only very briefly, at a theological anthropology. We begin in the book of Genesis. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." We are created. We are created in the image of God. We are created male and female. We are blessed. We are created with purpose. John Kilner's Dignity and Destiny reminds us that Jesus Christ is the image of God, and that we human beings are created in, after, or according to that image. And then we are placed bodily in community, actually in many communities, communities of community. Nancy Pearcey writes, each of us begins life as a dependent, helpless baby, born into a pre-existing family, clan, church, town, nation. We grow into mature adults only because other people, especially our parents, commit to us sacrificially to love, teach, and care for us. One upshot for bioethics is, as Andy Crouch writes, whenever policy is made and preferences are shaped by the dream of escaping the vulnerabilities, givenness, and interdependence of human life, our bodies will be despised, and those who treat embodied persons with reverence will be mocked. Therefore, we must both rely on and communicate a robust, biblically based, theologically precise concept of the human person that clarifies and affirms the givenness, vulnerabilities, and interdependence, the goodness of embodied human life. Notably, this does not always have to be done in biblical or theological terminology. Take, for example, Carter Snead's excellent book, What It Means to Be Human, as a case in point. As you may know, in that volume, he develops a sound picture of, as the title indicates, what it means to be human, namely embodied, placed in community, interdependent. And he spells out specific ways in which these are implicated in the realm of bioethics. Even more, he illuminates ways in which we might better understand ourselves, our fellow human beings, which leads to caring well for others and, so importantly, allowing ourselves to be well cared for. Part of the way in which he does this is by developing what he terms the virtues of acknowledged dependence, or the virtues of embodied life. And you see them there on the screen: just generosity, hospitality, merciful compassion, gratitude, humility, openness to the unbidden, solidarity, dignity, and truthfulness. These are the virtues of embodied life. These are only the beginnings, the merest of beginnings of a robust anthropology that will guide us as we live together and care for one another. As created, embodied, dependent, rational creatures, the Christian stake in bioethics is exactly this. Bioethics addresses the question of how we treat human beings in the specific context of the frailties of human life in the aftermath of the fall. The issues of bioethics are complex, pressing, intimate, and they carry implications for the broader society. They're complex because we must understand and navigate both the medical and ethical realities of the situations. They're pressing because they involve questions of what should or should not be done for this patient right here, right now. Further, this patient is often a friend, a loved one, a parent, my child, me. They're intimate because they sometimes involve parts of our bodies that we'd rather not talk about. They often affect our ability to tend to such things as bathing or using the toilet. And these issues carry larger implications for society because, quite simply, it matters what we do and do not pursue when it comes to matters of life and health. These questions of bioethics yesterday, today, and tomorrow are quite literally vital. And so, may we as Christians keep in the forefront of our minds that the context for medicine is this: the alleviation of the bitter consequences of the fall, staying the hand of death for a season, and anticipating the final resurrection of the body. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've been listening to Dr. Matthew Eppinette on bioethics yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And wow, that was really quite a comprehensive overview of where we've been, where we are today, and intertwined with that, where we're going in the future, that we know. We've got a time of question and answer now. So, Matthew, I love the way that you framed that with the quotes from Nigel Cameron, the question of how we treat human beings in the specific context of the frailties of human life in the aftermath of the fall. And you talked about then alleviation of the consequences of the fall, but also and the slowing of death where conceivable, but also looking forward to the resurrection of the body as well. Of course, tied into all of these things are the Christian concepts of being made in the image of God, and of course, as you elucidated, being embodied creatures as well. I wanted to come back first of all to the question of the Judeo-Christian ethic and the Hippocratic Oath, because we obviously there's a lot of confluence between the two. But I wonder if you could just comment briefly on the differences between the Hippocratic tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition, where the Hippocratic tradition is useful, where we might have concerns about it.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the Hippocratic tradition, of course, swears oaths to many gods. So that sets it distinctly apart from the Judeo-Christian tradition, recognizing the one true God. And of course, it was developed many thousands of years ago, such that our medical technology and our knowledge has developed. I mean, isn't part of the Hippocratic Oath that you will not conduct surgery. But we've learned so much more since then about germs and anesthesia and other things that really differentiate the practice of surgery today from what would have been known at the time of the organizing of the Hippocratic school. And so we do want to be careful and thoughtful about what we take from that, and what we sort of discard or just let lie from the Hippocratic tradition. But of course, the Christian tradition throughout, from even the earliest days of the church, was known, at least in part, for their care for the sick, their accompanying of the dying, their taking in of infants that had been left to die, abandoned. This is something the church has been known throughout the ages, and so that's where you begin to see this sort of coming together of not just wanting to care for one another, but care for others well, and thus the physician and the parts of the oath that talk about professionalism and confidentiality, that talk about mentoring the next generation, allowing yourself to be mentored. So there, like so many things from the ancient world, there are things that we take away from it, that we hold on to, and there are other things that we leave to the side.
As you've said, there's a lot more confluence, it seems, between the Judeo-Christian and the Hippocratic view than there is between the Judeo-Christian view and the post-Christian secular view as well. To look at some specific issues, you started off with euthanasia and AI, and in particular, you gave us an overview of what's happening in Canada, the fourth commonest cause of death, more even than cerebrovascular disease. That's quite chilling. And you talked about the important alternative of good palliative care, hospices, and so on, and the way that these services had expanded recently in the US as well. But I wanted to come back to the economic question, because, of course, critics might say that the cost of care even if it's palliative care, let alone chemotherapy or surgery, is actually so extraordinarily much more than the cost of, to put it bluntly, a tumbler full of barbiturate or a lethal injection. That couldn't the same argument be used that we're going to provide much better medical care to those who really need it if we were to allow these economic rules to play, the marketplace really to come into this whole area. And I guess that raises the secondary question of how much do you think the drive to euthanasia and assisted suicide is being driven by a post-Christian secular ideology, and how much is being driven by just pure economics?
That's a great question, and it'd be, I think, difficult to separate out by percentages, but definitely both of those are in effect when it comes to people thinking about this. I think the forefront arguments tend to be the sort of post-Christian materialistic views that this world, this life is all that there is. Charles Taylor talks about it in terms of the immanent frame. There's nothing else out there. And so when this life ceases to be pleasurable or ceases to be meaningful in whatever way I deem that to be meaningful, it should simply be my autonomous right to put an end to it and not have to suffer, or not even to the level of suffering, but to the level of just, I'm just displeased with how this is going. At the same time, the economic realities are sort of always there. A lot of times we'll hear people talk about, I don't want to be a burden. And often what they mean by that is a financial burden, although, of course, one can be a burden to others emotionally in ways that take time and other things. And that's a notion that I would like to disabuse folks of. Gilbert Meilander has an article several years old now in which he proclaims, I want to be a burden to my children. That, the one quote there from Nancy Pearcey talks about the way in which parents sacrifice for and care for their children. And in the same way, those of us who are children, I think if we reframe this, can see the opportunity that it is to care for our parents or our grandparents as they age. And so this notion of being a burden, I think, is one that we do well to rethink and reconsider. And then I do think that there's a tendency towards a sort of vitalism that does have the consequence of expense in some cases. And so one of the things that we try and do, that I try and do when I speak in churches, is to help people think about that there is a time to die, meaning there's a time to withdraw treatment or even to withhold treatment. There are certain situations in which a treatment is more burdensome than is beneficial. And I don't know that we're really accustomed to thinking in those terms when it comes to these end-of-life treatments. And so I don't want to be driven by primarily economic interests or economic realities, but I do think there's a time for rethinking a sort of vitalism and accepting that death is a part of life, and as I mentioned there at the end, that we await a bodily resurrection.
Yes, thank you. And Professor John Wyatt talks about mutual burdensomeness as being part of humanity, and of course, it's St. Paul himself, doesn't he say, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So it cuts to the very heart of Christian morality. A question here from a Scandinavian ethicist, Per Landgren, who's saying, many thanks. The quotes by Nigel Cameron were mainly theological, but how would you translate them into our secularized society using philosophical terms and concepts? And I was especially struck by the number of media inquiries that you get at CBHD. And so you're having to talk into a context that does not share your Christian biblical presuppositions. How do you communicate?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And, instead of talking about the fall, we can talk about the fact that disease, death, and despair, these are part of the human condition. However you believe that we arrived at that, this is where we are. And so the practice of medicine is really dedicated to addressing these. Death has, someone said the other day, a 100% success rate. And so that's a reality of medicine, that we are staying the hand of death for a time. And so we can, through that, care well for one another. We can suffer with one another, accompany one another in our suffering. Those virtues of embodied life that I highlighted, none of those are in theological terms, but they are things toward which I think all people could strive. Humility, suffering with one another, recognizing the dignity of others, being truthful with one another. So there are times, though, of course, where it's appropriate to, I think, call out, to highlight that we do sometimes have very differing central or core beliefs, and they play out then in different ways. So when I talk about vitalism, that definitely looks different for those of us who are awaiting a bodily resurrection than to those who believe that when they are dead, that is the end, and there's just nothing further.
Yeah, sure. So you talked about embodied life, and there is a question here about attaining the virtues of embodied life, making the point that it's by caring for vulnerable people that we ourselves learn to become compassionate and other-focused. The question is, if this caring, from Uta Halboa is asking, if this caring is no longer needed or done, how will society grow these virtues?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, as they say. What will become of these virtues if we stop doing these things? And I fear that they would atrophy, and that we might become more insular, more atomized, and perhaps even more not just uncaring, but perhaps even vicious towards one another. I mean, perhaps this is part of what we see in social media, is a real lack of these kind of embodied virtues that goes along with the lack of embodied presence that is sometimes associated with social media. I really fear that these virtues would simply atrophy, and that those communities that can prioritize the bodily care for one another, the face-to-face interaction with one another, will attain virtues that others simply will not attain.
Yeah, indeed. Come back to the whole area of CRISPR, and in particular gene editing. And you, on the one hand, you talked about the amazing successes of somatic gene editing in the proper circumstances, with a specific example of sickle cell disease. But then you talked about the ruling from the first global conference about the dangers of gene editing, at least at this present time. You also referred to the 14-day rule for experimentation on the human embryo. And of course, so many of these issues involve instrumentation or work or disposal, freezing, or whatever, of early human embryos, that all the reproductive technologies and the more recent things as well are predicated upon that. I wonder if you just comment for us on how the biblical principles that we see and that you've enunciated relate to the way that we view the human embryo as regards to other, embryos of other species, or, AI-produced entities.
Well, I think probably foremost is this recognition that we're created in or after the image of God, and that begins at the single cell stage of the human embryo, that the human species is differentiated from all other species on the planet, and that each of us began life as an embryo. We were never a sperm or an egg, but each of us was an embryo. And there is a direct path of development that is well known and well established that moves from that to who we are today. And so we are really mistaken when we fail to see that those embryos, even at the one cell stage, are just as human as us, just as created in the image of God as us. One of the other things that I've been working on and thinking about recently is the way in which our Christological beliefs inform our embryological beliefs. Oliver Crisp from there in the United Kingdom has done some of the first work that I found on this. I'm sure others might have done it as well, but it's the first I became aware of. And just talking about, if you look at some of the ancient heresies that the church opposed down through the ages that led to our various creeds and agreements, Chalcedon and other things, if we're not thinking properly about the embryo and the embryological Christ, the conception that took place in Mary's body, we can easily fall back into some of these heresies, that if we believe that the embryo doesn't become a person until so many days or such and such a stage, well, that's a heresy that the church already dealt with, the idea that the being was living and then Christ somehow assumed it. That's a heresy that's been dealt with years and years ago. So I think that's an area that needs further development and further research, and that I think can be quite compelling to those of us who are Christ followers. Of course, that's not going to appeal much to those who do not follow Christ. But as I say, there's a continuous line of development that you've got the sperm and you've got the egg. They come together. That's something brand new, something completely different. There's no other change past that operates in nearly the same way. There's this straight line of well-known, well-understood development. And I think that those are the sorts of things we need to emphasize to our non-Christian, our secular colleagues.
Yes, it's been said that the only difference between you and me and an embryo is nutrition and time. Well, that's
right.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, just again on the issue of embodiment, and when you went through the Christian theological anthropology, you talked about embodiment. You also hinted in that about how it impacts upon the issue of sexuality and gender. And it's been said that Genesis 1:26-28 is unashamedly binary in a sense. Any comment on how a Christian theological understanding of anthropology impacts upon the whole debate around transgenderism?
Yeah, I think it's very clear from Scripture, and it's one of those things I can remember wondering about years ago. Like, why is Scripture so emphatic about this male and female binary? And now we're beginning to see, I think, some of the pushback against that really makes it much more clear why Scripture from thousands of years ago was so emphatic about this, that God knew and saw what was coming. Lots of people raise the issue of intersex, and certainly those are malformations and variabilities that occur very rarely. But they do not then lead us toward thinking that there's no binary. They're the exceptions that prove the rule. And so I think that we simply have to cling to God's word and frankly the clarity of God's word on this issue, that we're created male and female. Now, we don't want to overly narrowly draw the dimensions of what it means to be masculine or feminine. And I think there may have been some tendencies from some people to draw those in ways that, well, if you're not out, chopping lumber and building and breaking things, then you're just not manly enough. I think that's kind of an absurd notion. And so there may be room to expand our concepts of what we mean by masculine and feminine. But that does not mean that we break into new categories or that there becomes some other thing beyond the male and the female as simple, basic realities.
Thank you. Sadly, we've run out of time virtually, but I just wanted to ask you one more question. We have people from all over the world, probably 60 different countries listening in today, or even more who'll be watching the recording. And you've spoken perhaps largely from a US and Canadian or Western perspective, but these issues are screaming up the agenda all over the world. What's a present reality here will be there tomorrow. And I just wanted to ask you, ICMDA does quite a lot of training in bioethics. We have a 14-week course where Professor John Wyatt has done a series of talks. Lots of people from all over the world have done this. But what advice would you give to a doctor or dentist who's begun to engage with bioethics, has perhaps been to this course, and then is wanting really to go deeper? What sort of routes would you describe? And we could certainly add some of these in the letter we write to people tomorrow, but just off the cuff, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are a number of very good book resources out there. Gil Mylander's books on bioethics are outstanding. You could read some of the older works. Paul Ramsey's works from the late 60s and early 70s are terrific. Be familiar with the secular ways of thinking as well. I mean, Principles of Biomedical Ethics is in the 8th or 9th edition now. And that really rules the roost when it comes to secular medical ethics and bioethics. So it'd be another place to look. I mean, just to make kind of a pitch, here at Trinity, we offer both certificate programs and degree programs focused on bioethics. And taught from a Judeo-Christian perspective. So that would be another way if you wanted to go deeper. Those can be done online remotely. And I can add some resources that can be listed in the show notes for the video when it goes onto YouTube.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And so it just remains to me to say thank you so much, Dr. Matthew, for your time and input today, to sticking with us to answer the questions as well, for all the work that you're doing. May the Lord really bless your institution and those who teach there, the students who are going through it, and give you many more opportunities. So we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. May the Lord bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.